Hello, hello. I can sing to you to make you quiet, but then you may holler a little more. So how's everyone doing? I'm Judge Anita Laster Mays, and I have the honor of introducing, what, someone was clapping, they wanted me to sing? Look, how are you doing? No. I have the honor of introducing Judge Sean Gallagher. Judge Gallagher and I have been friends for a long time. And one of the things that I always say about him is that he knows the court from the custodial work through the judicial work, because at some point he was a custodian, he was at the court, juvenile court, I should say. He was a probation officer, a bailiff, a trial court judge, and now an appellate court judge. And so you can ask him anything about the court and also the secret corners around the court as well. But this presentation that he is about to do is a very good and interesting presentation. And it's a landmark case, and he tells it so well. He's a very good historian within the court, and he brings that knowledge also on the bench with us. And so, again, it is my pleasure to introduce Judge Sean Gallagher.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. Judge, my favorite judge. You are my favorite judge. To invoke Judge Larry Jones, Judge, our former colleague Larry Jones would always refer to us as his favorite judge, usually when he wanted something, but but he did mean it. And Judge Mays, thank you so much. And all the other judges that are here. Judge Groves, I'm not sure why you're not sitting with Greg, but my wife would make a comment about me if I wasn't sitting there, but no. So anyway, I thought I would start out though with a little bit of humor. My cousins in Ireland always like to give me some Irish jokes, so I always like to go through these. And excuse me for kind of reading this one a little bit. It's short. So this fellow Murphy walks into the police station and asks to speak to the head of the Garda. The Garda in Ireland is the police department. And when the chief comes out, Murphy tells him he wants to be, a member of the police force. And the chief says, "Come back in my office and have a seat. I'd like to ask you a few questions." And the chief says, "What's 2 + 2?" And Murphy says, "Right, that's easy. The answer is 4. Okay, what's the square root of 100? And Murphy thought for a moment and answered, "I think it's 10. The chief said, "You're doing great. Now, can you tell me who killed Abraham Lincoln?" And Murphy thought about it for a while and he replied, "No, I can't." And the chief told him, "Find out who killed Abraham Lincoln and come back and see me." So later in the pub that night, a guy named Sullivan asks how the job interview went. And Murphy replied, "Not only did I get the job, but the chief already put me on a murder case." So the Irish love those stories. But so I'm going to cover 2 cases today, Map v. Ohio and Terry v. Ohio. And I like to do this from a completely different perspective because everybody that's a lawyer has read Map v. Ohio in law school, or you read Terry v. Ohio in law school. And if you're not intimately aware of all the details and the law that it represents, we'll touch on some of that. But believe me, I'm not going to be citing to paragraph 34 of any opinions or referencing anything like that. I like to take a different approach on law and history, and let's look at the people that were involved in the cases. Who were these people that made up these cases? And I think you'll find this rather remarkable, that Map v. Ohio was really a story about 2 different and separate cases that were intertwined. And within Map v. Ohio, there is arguably 2 separate legal issues that were decided during the course of the case. So I'm going to go through this and we'll take you back in time a little bit. There's a little bit of Cleveland history here. And I think it's an interesting story. And I think you're going to see some things that you did not know about some people in the past. So let me start this out. This is Dalry Mapp. She was also known as Dolly Mapp. She was born in Austin, Texas on Halloween in 1930. She was the 4th of 6 children. Most people don't know this, but her father was a Cherokee Indian and her mother was African-American, and her mother was a school teacher in Texas. So in 1940, when she was 10 years old, in an effort to, obviously the South wasn't the greatest place for a young African-American girl. So she had a relative in Cleveland, and the families agreed that Dolly would move to Cleveland and live with her aunt and take advantage of educational opportunities and economic opportunities that were in the North. And she moved into the neighborhood in Cleveland that is kind of adjacent to Shaker. I think a lot of us like to call it the Cleveland school system that gets Shaker schools, or the Cleveland neighborhood that gets Shaker schools, that kind of reference. But she was a very bright student by all accounts. Many of the autobiographies that have been written about the case describe her as very outgoing, very assertive, and she was very popular with her schoolmates. Now, Alex Shonder Burns was an individual that was originally born in Hungary, and his family came to the United States in 1907 when he was a very small child. Now, he went by the name Shonder, which is an offshoot, I think, of a Hungarian reference for Alexander. But in Cleveland, among his friends, he was simply known as Sean. He was just the short Sean, so the people that were associated with him. Now, as a young adult, Burns was arrested 18 times over a 12-year period. In 1925, he was arrested and convicted of auto theft, and he spent a year in the Mansfield Reformatory. You remember the building for Shawshank Redemption. So he would have been there if there really was a Shawshank Redemption, he probably would have been one of the inmates with all the people in that movie. He also was convicted of bribery in 1933. He only did 60 days for a bribery conviction in 1933. He lived off of Woodland Avenue in the Jewish quarter, South Woodland, that area, not far from where the cemeteries are when you're going out Woodland Avenue. Now, over the course of his criminal career, Burns often beat charges by producing alibi witnesses, paying for alibi witnesses, or influencing jurors with bribes to acquit him. So he was a well-known figure in Cleveland underworld circles. Here's one of Burns's arrest photos or mugshots. Now, he couldn't be in the mafia because he wasn't Italian, but he was indeed very much involved in the mafia and interacted with them regularly. He developed a reputation as a brutal, ruthless enforcer. He often worked with the mafia to establish a lucrative protection service. He ruled by fear and intimidation. He often used bombs as preferred method of sending a clear message to anyone who crossed him. He extorted money on a weekly basis from numbers and policy operators on Cleveland's east side, predominantly all African Americans that ran the policy and clearinghouse games on Cleveland's east side. Burns would extort money for. Now, despite the extortion, in many instances, he had what can be described as a good relationship with many of these operators, in part because he helped keep the peace between groups. Now, in terms of his criminal background, he also had a number of front businesses, if you will, to shield his criminal activity. He often referred to himself as a labor consultant, and he described himself as an executive of the Union Supply and Towel Company, which I found out was located originally on East 34th Street in Cleveland. He also owned a place on Chester at 1011 Chester, which surprisingly enough was known as the 1011 Club. And he also owned the Alhambra Tavern at 103rd and Euclid. So he had legitimate business interests that were out there, but his primary operation was in the rackets and in enforcement and working with the mafia and other underworld figures. Now, let's talk a little bit about the numbers rackets. I look around the room, and most of you were born after the advent of the Ohio Lottery. And the Ohio Lottery was passed by Ohio voters in 1973. The first game came into play in August of 1974. And we didn't really have what we would call the machine lottery, you know, where you go to the gas station or you go to the delicatessen or the corner store. That didn't come in until 1979. But back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, particularly in African-American communities and large major cities in the North, there were numbers games. And there were two primary illegal gambling games in the 40s and 50s, which were called clearinghouse and policy. Now, clearinghouse games were also referred to as a numbers game, and it involved players picking a number 000 to 999. Now, you think the Ohio Lottery is so creative. They stole all of their games from African-American operators in the past. I mean, they stole literally. They copied them exactly as they were. Even the clearinghouse game and the policy game. The policy game was with ping pong balls. And as I did this research, I kind of snickered and laughed at remembering when you watch that show that's on at 7:15 every night when the ping pong balls come out. I mean, it was like a policy game in a black neighborhood 50, 60, 75 years ago. So all those things were stolen from these operators and legitimized for, of course, tax purposes. So policy, though, came from the idea of having an insurance policy. So what an operator might do is approach you, not unlike the drug trade where there are code phrases and names. An operator might approach you and ask, do you want to buy an insurance policy? Well, that means you want to play policy. You want to play the game. So people would do this. Now, on this slide, there's an image of a book here called New Gipsy. It's a dream book. So how did this work? What were these dream books? Well, you go into delicatessens today and you see like there's the Cleveland Scene. It's free. You pick it up, right? There's apartment magazines you can pick up for free, Auto Trader free, cars.com free, whatever. These policy books were often produced by numbers operators and distributed around the community, or they were sold in some instances. But a dream book would be this. Let's say you went to sleep last night and you dreamed about a train, a locomotive train. You woke up in the morning and you said, geez, I had a crazy dream about a train last night. Well, you could go to the dream book and open up the dream book and look under train, and it would give you a numbers or a series of numbers to play. And so this was one of the ways that policy was played. So policy was the ping pong ball game. Clearinghouse is the straight numbers game. And I mean, it was very, very common. You could pay as little, you play as little as a penny. And these games were racking in $20,000, $25,000 a day for some operators in the community. Just unbelievable. So how did they work exactly? Well, here's an example of a shoe shine parlor in the late 30s that fronted as a policy house. Like in the back room, that sort of deal, you'd have, not all the games the numbers operators could come, you send a runner out to come to your house and pick up your bet, but also people could go to a location and play. Now, there were 6 to 8, depending on the era, major numbers operators on Cleveland's east side. Some of them were William Buckeye Jackson. I don't know how William got the nickname Buckeye, but maybe he had some tie to Ohio State. I don't know. Ed Keeling, Elijah Abercrombie, Sam Elmore, Fred Stitman, Virgil Ogletree, and Thomas Church. Those were the major players in Cleveland. So a writer would collect the bets and he would keep 25% of the total collected. And these bets would then be turned over to a pickup person and eventually end up at a clearinghouse where all the bets would be tallied by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, very creatively, they had a way of assuring how they could measure if you won or lost. Those involved as pickup persons earned 10% of what they took in. And in the 1950s, winners were determined by looking at the stock market tallies in the Cleveland News. Cleveland News was similar to the old Cleveland Press in that it was published in the afternoons. It went out of business many, many years ago. But under advances, declines, and unchanged, there would be a series of 3-digit numbers, and those numbers would determine whether you won or lost. So everybody in the community was reading the stock pages. In those days, there was a tremendous interest in stocks, but that's how the winners were determined. And then the runner would either come back and pay you your winnings the next day, or you could go to a policy house or a clearinghouse and collect your winnings. But it was all an elaborate operation within the community. So let's go back to Dolly or Dalray map. And every autobiography, there are 3 probably decent ones. The 2 of them focus more on the case, but have a lot of information about her. But a woman named Patricia's, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Zatane. She wrote a pretty extensive biography of her in the late 1990s. And she described her as charming and cunning. She was very streetwise. She was extremely attractive with model looks. And she used her looks and her personality and her charm to her advantage. And a lot of powerful men, and let's face it, this was an era when men were, controlling everything all the time. And she managed to get the upper hand with many men that crossed paths with her in her relationships or in any of her business dealings. She was very, very sophisticated, and she became involved with a lot of the major gamblers and a lot of the major boxing figures of the era in the 1950s. She would be seen at nightclubs around Cleveland. And so she was a very, very interesting individual. Now, she got involved with Jimmy Bivens. And Jimmy Bivens was a legendary boxer. And they had a daughter named Barbara. And this was a very tumultuous relationship between these two. They were constantly fighting and battling. But Bivens was one of the top boxers in the United States from 1940 to 1953. He had a record of 86 wins, 25 losses, and 1 tie, and he won 31 fights by knockout. He defeated 8 of the 11 world champions he faced during his career, and he's inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1999. Now, sadly, Jimmy Bivens died in Cleveland in 2012 under really tragic circumstances. He ended up with a caregiver and was left on the 3rd floor of a residence and basically to rot away and die. And he died there. And I believe the individual was prosecuted for the care that was given to him. So Bivens was a very accomplished boxer and very well known. And Map and her tumultuous relationship. But when she left Bivens, she got involved with Archie Moore. And Archie Moore was another world famous boxer, champion. After the divorce, she got involved with Moore. And at one point, Moore was the oldest boxer to win the world's light heavyweight championship. He was the only boxer who fought professionally in all the eras of Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, and Muhammad Ali. His career spanned 4 decades. And we'll take a look at this record. 185 wins, 23 losses, 11 draws, 1 no contest, and 131 knockouts. Archie Moore was an accomplished boxer in the world of boxing. So in the 1950s, Map filed a lawsuit against Archie Moore at one point. This shows you how driven Dolly Map could be. She filed a $750,000 in the 1950s, folks, lawsuit for breach of contract. What was the breach of contract? He had promised to marry her and reneged on the promise. She also claimed he had assaulted her, and eventually the case was dismissed as baseless. But it does give some insight into just how forceful and strong-willed a person Dolly Map was. Now, on May 28th, 1954, Dolly would have her first encounter with the authorities. She was stopped and arrested by officers Carl DeLau and Michael Haney, 2 officers who would later play a role in the Map case. She was charged with possession of clearinghouse slips and clearinghouse paraphernalia. She was fined $100. There's a picture of her and Moore after one of Moore's fights. Now, Carl DeLau served under General Patton in World War II. He earned a Purple Heart, or was awarded a Purple Heart after being wounded in October of 1944 in France. DeLau was sworn in as a Cleveland police officer on January 2nd of 1946. Now, over his time in the police department, he gradually transitioned over to become involved in vice crimes, and he joined the Cleveland Police Bureau of Special Operations, which was kind of the prostitution, gambling, vice, that type of division within the police department in the 40s and 50s. Now, interestingly enough, on August 9th of 1949 at 2:30 in the morning, he stopped Chandra Burns for speeding on the Shoreway. It made the news because at the time, Cleveland law enforcement had a policy that if you were going over 60 miles an hour for a speeding offense, you had to be booked. So Burns told DeLau, "Hey, just let me go. I'm Chandra Burns." And DeLau said, "No, you're coming with me." Down to the station he went, and he got booked. Well, the news media picked up on this. And of course, they ran a story, which I was able to find online. So Burns lived at 1063 Cove Avenue in Lakewood. That's the eastern edge of Lakewood near Clifton Boulevard for most of his career. Now, here's another interesting figure from the story, which is Frank T. Culleton. And Frank T. Culleton was the Cuyahoga County prosecutor from 1925, for 25 years, rather, from 1931 to 1956. He personally led the raid on 2 notorious gambling spots, deputizing private agency workers because he couldn't trust the elected sheriff at the time. There's some famous pictures of Culleton and Elliot Ness on some of these raids at Harvard Avenue. If you go under the Cleveland Memory Project of the Cleveland Public Library. There's a whole series of photographs about this era. And Culleton is a very interesting character because he would go out on raids personally. He tried cases personally. He was very active, very involved. And like I say, worked very closely with Elliot Ness. And in 1954, during the Sam Shepard murder investigation, he threatened to remove the Cleveland detectives who were aiding Bay Village on the case unless they acted to charge Sam Shepard with Marilyn's murder. He felt that the Bay Village authorities were being a little too protective of Sam Shepard. And I thought one of the poignant aspects about his life when I read about it was he left office in 1956 and he died in June of 1957. And he reached out to the prosecutor's office. He didn't, he was dead. His wife reached out to the prosecutor's office and asked that 6 prosecutors come and serve as his pallbearer for his funeral, which they did. So he passed away in 1957. Now, following him was John T. Corrigan. And many of you in this room will remember John T. Corrigan. I worked under John T. Corrigan in the prosecutor's office. What some people don't know about him was he was shot and lost an eye in the Battle of the Bulge. Whenever you had a conversation with him, you always knew to look in a certain way so he could make sure he could see and understand what you were trying to convey. But he was elected county prosecutor in 1956. He then served 35 years and retired in January of 1991. So between Culleton and Corrigan, they served, what is the math on that? 60 years, 60-year period where they were prosecutors. Now, one of the things that Corrigan did that will have a play in this map case going forward is he hired a woman named Gertrude Mann. And her name was Gertrude Bauer originally, but he assigned her in the 1950s the map case. Now imagine that, a woman in the 1950s, a woman lawyer, as remarkable as that is assigned a case that ends up as significant as map is in our criminal jurisprudence. And she's given the case and she handles it all the way through. Corrigan went with her to the very first pretrial or the arraignment of the case, and she was on her own the rest of the way. And it was an era when really, let's face it, women were second-class citizens in professional circles, certainly in the law. Now another little side note about Corrigan is in 1960, when the MAP case was pending, it hadn't reached the U.S. Supreme Court yet. MAP's lawyer was a fellow named Alexander Kearns, who I'll touch on in a moment. But Kearns decided to run against Corrigan for the prosecutor job. You can imagine this case is going on, and the two lawyers, or at least the supervising lawyer, Corrigan, was being challenged by MAP's lawyer. So obviously Corrigan won the case, or won the election. So kind of interesting. So what about Gertie Mann? Her friends called her Gertie. She was in the prosecutor's office. I don't know, Greg Groves, you at least probably heard of her. I mean, she was right before kind of all our eras, you know. Not trying to put age on you, Greg. Yes, right. So Gertie Mann was born in Toledo, Ohio on December 11th, 1904. She graduated from Mary Mann's College in Toledo. She attended Cleveland Marshall. She graduated in 1940. When I went there, I went to where all the old photos were, and she's the only woman in her 1940 class. Imagine that. It had to be pretty tough. But in a testament to her obvious talent, Corrigan picks her to handle the MAP case from the trial court level all the way Supreme Court level. And as another interesting sidelight about her, she married John Mann. Now that name doesn't mean anything to you now, maybe, but he was the original prosecutor on the first Sam Shepard case. And they ended up marrying, and John Mann would go on to become a judge after the Shepard case. And in fact, his son, Bill Mann, who some of you probably remember, was also on the case. I'll tell you a fast, funny story about Bill Mann, who is the Gertie Mann's technically stepson. But on December 7th, 1941, Bill Mann was a student at Notre Dame. And that day, it was common on Sundays to go to the movies in the afternoon. So at noon on December 7th, 1941, of course, Hawaii time is 6 hours or whatever behind. He goes to the movies, and when he comes out, everybody's yelling, "The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor." And finally, Bill Mann and everybody turns to each other, "Where is Pearl Harbor?" Nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was in 1941, which is not a surprise. Okay, so Don King, yes, that Don King is involved in Map v. Ohio. Most people don't know this. When you read the case in law school, you don't know that Don King was involved, but he was born in Cleveland on August 20th, 1931. He was also always referred to as the Kid back in those days. He handled some of the most prominent names later in his career in boxing, including Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield. But before all that worldwide success, King was involved in Cleveland's underworld as a numbers operator. Now, Don King was involved in 2 killings during his time as an operator. On December 19th, 1954, King shot a man named Hillary Brown in the back and killed him when Brown attempted to rob one of King's gambling houses. The shooting was later ruled justifiable. He was also convicted of second-degree murder in 1966 in the killing of Sam Garrett, who was one of his employees who reneged apparently on a $600 debt. The judge later reduced the charge to manslaughter. King served 4 years in prison. He was later pardoned in 1983 by then Governor Jim Rhodes. Now we get to the story of 2 cases where 2 cases intersect in Map and what I'll call the bombing case and the extortion case. So this is 3713 East 131st Street. And Judge Mays always likes to remind me that she grew up right around the corner from us. But in the spring of 1957, King lived downstairs in this 2-family double. And in the mid 1950s, King was paying Burns $200 a week in protection money. Now, Burns went to prison for tax evasion in 1955, and obviously King stopped paying at that point. When Burns returned in 1957, he once again began to extort money from all the numbers operators. Everyone paid except King. So now, 3 days before we get to the Map case and the Map search of Dolly's home, in the early morning hours of Monday, May 20th, 1957, a bomb explodes on the front porch of King's residence. King immediately suspected Burns was responsible. He knew other numbers operators like William Buckeye Jackson, Virgil Ogletree, Edward Keeling, Dan Boone, Elijah Abercrombie, Sam Elmore, and Fred Stipman were all associated with Chandra Burns. And these are the actual police photos from the bombing. So King was uninjured, but surprisingly to many, King went to Delau, Detective Delau, because he knew Delau was the one person who could respond to Burns' attack. And again, many were surprised that King would go to the police. But in the end, Burns and others, all the other operators, were charged with blackmail based on the information provided by King. King told police how the numbers operators worked, what the deals were, what the arrangements were, how much everybody had to pay. And everybody was charged. And this was a high-profile trial in Cleveland in the late 1950s. So during the pendency of the case, King is shot. He informs the police about the activity of Burns and numbers operators, and now he's on his own. While the blackmail case was pending against Chandra Burns and the others, King was shot in the back upon returning one night as a warning not to testify. Fearless, King testifies anyway. Now, Dolly would also be called as a witness in this trial to testify. She got on the witness stand and refused to say anything, and she told the judge, "I'm afraid to say anything. If I say anything, I might end up where I don't want to end up." So she was called as a witness to testify. She didn't testify. All the defendants were found not guilty because the only real evidence against them was King's testimony. And that just wasn't enough to support a conviction. So they all went free. Now, 3 days after that initial bombing and before this trial took place, this is Dalry Mapp's residence on Milverton Avenue, 14705 Milverton Avenue. It looks very much like it did back in those days today. 2-family residence, even though it doesn't look like that. Mapp resided with her daughter Barbara in the upstairs section. But on that day, Thursday, May 23rd, 1957, Delau shows up and wants to come inside. Now, the reason why Delau and the police show up at Mapp's residence is they're looking for Virgil Ogletree. who they believe might have been the bomber of King's home. And they also want to go in there because they think there's going to be gambling, paraphernalia, policy slips, clearinghouse materials, or whatever. And at that time, after a bombing like this, there, of course, the police are coming down hard on all the numbers people. And so they show up at the door, they pound on the door, and map shows you, I mean, you're talking now about, what is this, 57 to today? It's, what is that, 60, more than 60 years ago. She's smart enough to say, you got a warrant? I mean, think about all the cases we have where people don't ask for a warrant, but she was smart enough to ask for a warrant. Not only did she ask for a warrant, she gets on the phone and calls her lawyer while the cops are outside. And she calls Alexander Kearns, who's her lawyer, but actually the person who answers the phone is Walter Green, another lawyer, because Kearns is not in the office at the time. And Green advises her, well, do they have a warrant? And she says, I don't think so. And she goes, well, if they don't have a warrant, don't let them in. And Green decides he's going to go over there, and he brings his camera. And in one of the sad points of history, he takes a bunch of pictures, but then stupidly exposes them, ruining the film. So we would have had photos of all this today if that hadn't happened. But that home is 4.2 miles from this location that we're at today. So this is all very local and very local history. So Thursday, May 23rd, 1957, he doesn't have a warrant. So Delau calls his supervisor. He actually had to go up to the corner and use a phone. No cell phones, folks, in 1957. So the supervisor says another officer is coming out with a warrant. And when that officer arrives, a search commences. But police really don't have a warrant at that point. Police do find Virgil Ogletree and some gambling records. Virgil was in the basement. And they also find 4 obscene books in Mapp's residence. Now, the books were titled The Affairs of the Troubadour, Little Darlings, London Stage Affairs, and Memories of a Hotel Man. Can't make this stuff up, folks. So Mapp is arrested, and she's charged with felony possession of obscene materials under then 2905.34. So here is the one-page police report, and there's a lot of one-pageisms in this case and the following case. So Delau files this police report covering the activities of police following the bombing of King's home and the search of Mapp's residence. There's no mention in the report about getting a warrant or the absence of a warrant. And at the subsequent trial of Burns and those numbers operated, again, Dolly was called as a witness, but she refused to answer questions out of fear. So these cases were kind of inexplicably connected together in one form. So now what about this obscenity charge? Revised Code 2905.34 at that time said that no person shall knowingly have in his possession or under his control an obscene, lewd, or I can't even pronounce that. Lascivious. Yeah, I know. I always have trouble with that, you know, print or picture. So you could get a fine of not less than 200 or more than 2,000. How about this? The penalty was 1 to 7 years, an indefinite term of 1 to 7 years. So Mapp initially pleads guilty on July 8th of 1958, but then she subsequently withdraws her guilty plea on August 1st of 1958. What's the one thing we all know? That ain't happening in today's world, right? You try to withdraw a guilty plea today. So her trial was commenced in September of 1958, and the jury quickly returned a verdict of guilty. This is the one-page complaint that was filed, and again, you know, she was quickly convicted. Now, she was represented by Alexander Kearns, who I mentioned earlier. He was the past president of the Cuyahoga County Bar Association. He was active in Republican politics at that time. He graduated from Central High School, Baldwin Wallace College of Law, and Cleveland Law School. And again, like I said, he ran against John T. Corrigan for prosecutor when the Mapp case was pending. He lost that election, and he died in February of 1968. So the motion to suppress, a lot of one-isms I said in this. It was one page. Want to remind everybody out there that likes to ask for extensions of space in their briefs that this was a one-page summary brief in the most important criminal case in American history. So and how about this? He cited no cases. He cited the Ohio statute that said you have to have a warrant to have a search. So sometimes the easiest arguments are the simplest arguments. So he did not initially challenge the constitutionality of the obscenity statute. He solely focused on the search issue. It was only later when Bernard Berkman from the ACLU and Jack Day and those individuals would come in that the First Amendment speech issue would become a prominent thing. Now, what I find fascinating about this motion to suppress, take a look at it. The service clause fits on the same page with the motion to suppress. Now that is efficient lawyering. So there you go. Keep that in mind. Any law students out there, hope they watch that. So here's our trial judge, Judge Leibarger, Don Leibarger. He was the trial judge of the MAP case. Some of you may remember his son, Lynn Leibarger, who's a lawyer. I think he had his office in Parma for many years. Leibarger upheld the obscenity law to the extent that that was within this case and the seizure of the materials from MAP's home without a warrant. He then sentenced MAP to 1 to 7 years in jail at the Ohio State Reformatory for Women. He did die on November 6, 1970. Perhaps aware of the significance of this case, he did give her an appeal bond. So she was out. She didn't do any time in jail on the conviction. Now, as fate would have it, the case, of course, was appealed to the 8th District Court of Appeals. And at that time, the 8th District only had 3 judges, Judge Joyce Seth Hurd, Judge Julius Cavacci, and Judge Skeel. One thing I will say about Seth Hurd is he had 68 grandchildren. I was able to check that out, so that's legit. Now, what I also find fascinating about this is it was a 1-page opinion. A lot of 1 pages in this story, and it cited no case law. Hey, these were trend-setting decisions. It referenced Ohio Revised Code 294583, which has long since been repealed, but I went back and, or there's a different variant of it in the code now, but I went back and looked at it. It was basically an argument for when a new trial should or shouldn't be granted. But here's what the 8th District said about the whole case. This is what they said about MAP v. Ohio. Upon review of the entire case, we find no prejudicial error to the rights of the defendant. Yeah, this is 1959 America, so it's a different world, a different era. So now the case really starts to take on some significance because not only do we have this search issue that's out there, search of a home without a warrant, but also growing is this obscenity issue that she's convicted of something that is obscene. And keep in mind, the items that were seized from her home were found in what amounts to a Foot Locker in the basement. And she used to rent to boarders in that basement. And through a lot of trial and error and going through some of the autobiographies and books about it, to the best of everyone's knowledge, those materials were owned by somebody named Morris Jones, who was a renter of hers many years earlier. So this is not like Dolly Mapp had purported pornographic material. It was, you know, that's how remote this was as well. So these 3 individuals, Jack Day, Seymour Terrell, and Bernard Berkman, would get involved in the case from the ACLU. The media was covering this case, and all the, you know, the Cleveland Press, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Cleveland News, they were all covering this case. It started to take on some interest, so the ACLU got involved. One of the people I will talk about here is Jack Day. He served on the 8th District from 1968 to 1984. He also probably should be credited with reviving the ACLU in Ohio in 1950. He got together with some people and really tried to revive it after it had been dormant for a number of years. And Terrell and Berkman were really high quality lawyers who knew these types of issues very well. Day would participate in Jacobellis v. Ohio case. That's the case you all know as I know it when I see it, the famous Potter Stewart quote. So now we have free speech entering the pendulum here. So this case goes on to the Ohio Supreme Court in 1960. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but she almost won her case at this level. But for a strange twist in the Ohio Constitution that I believe was amended in either 1968 or 1994. I'm not an Ohio constitutional expert, but at that time you needed at least, I think you needed 6 votes to find a statute unconstitutional. And here they were 1 vote short. Taft, Zimmerman, Peck, Matthias, and Weygandt all sided with MAP on the obscenity question, but they didn't have 6 votes because 2 justices dissented. Now on the search issue, she lost that. Justice Herbert wrote the dissent in that case. So let me just touch on these individuals just real quickly. This is Justice Taft. He was born in Cleveland in 1903, writes the majority opinion from the Ohio Supreme Court and map. He graduated from Harvard, served in the Ohio legislature. He was on the Supreme Court from 48 until 1970 when he died. Interestingly enough, while on the court, he ran against the Chief Justice of the court. Imagine a contentious court that must have been. He ran against him and only lost by 1,772 votes statewide. So that didn't make for a happy Wednesday morning at the Supreme Court. But he also dissented in the Sam Shepard appeal, writing that he didn't believe the evidence supported a conviction. Now, Justice Herbert wrote the dissent. He was born in Cleveland, was a highly decorated World War I fighter pilot. He was a student of the law, and his biography says he loved ice cream and corn on the cob. You know, I had to include that. I mean, anybody who likes ice cream and corn on the cob gets a shout out. Now, he handed Governor Frank Lausche his only defeat in 6 gubernatorial elections in 1946. He lost to Lausche in a November 1948 rematch. And again, he wrote the dissent map focusing on the absence of a warrant, and he died in 1974. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention this judge, who is my favorite judge in Ohio history. And I'm going to tell you why. This is Judge Charles Zimmerman. He was born in 1891 in Springfield, Ohio. He's a Democrat. He served for 35 years on the Supreme Court. Now, this is what I love about him. He never felt confident enough in his job security, because no public official is, that to purchase a house in Columbus. So he traveled by bus from his home in Springfield each Tuesday morning, returning home the following Friday, and slept in his office on a cot for 35 years. And the old timers on the 2nd District tell me that he used to hitchhike on some days. When he missed the bus, he would hitchhike from Springfield to Columbus. Can you imagine? Where are you going? I'm going to the Supreme Court. True story about the guy. I don't know. They should put a big cot monument in Dayton somewhere for this guy, but I really just love the story about Zimmerman. So on the case goes to the United States Supreme Court. Earl Warren, it's the Warren Court. Hugo Black, Felix Frankfurter, William Douglas, Tom Clark, Harlan, Brennan, Whitaker, and Potter Stewart, who was from Cincinnati. So 1969, look at how quickly they got cases out then, right? March 29th, it's argued. It's decided June 19th. So justice delayed is not justice denied in that era. I'm sorry? No, not a little more detail at the federal level, I think. But that's great. I got to use that line if I can borrow it. So let's look at the prior precedent just real fast. State versus Lindway. This was the Ohio case, the Ohio law that the exclusionary rule was not adopted by Ohio for state court proceedings. The comparable federal case was Wolf v. Colorado in 1949, where the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 vote, decided the Fourth Amendment was applicable to the states through due process of the 14th Amendment, but not the exclusionary rule. So kind of had a law without an enforcement provision. So those were the stakes of the prior precedent at the time. There are 2 big issues. Obviously, Berkman wants to argue First Amendment, and he was totally focused on that with the ACLU. Kearns was more concerned about the second question, whether you could search a residence without a warrant. And so these were the 2 big issues that were before the court, and they summarily just ignored Berkman. I don't think they wanted to deal with pornography at that time or obscenity or the First Amendment, so they just ignored him. When you listen to the tapes of the argument, Berkman makes the far better argument. He's much more eloquent, much more distinguished, much more driven, but they just brush aside that and they go right to the search issue, and eventually they will apply the exclusionary rule to this case. So Kearns, one-page Kearns was pretty good. He ends up winning the case. But there was one other humorous thing from the tape. If you ever go back and listen to the tape, Gertrude Mann, who I never think women's bar groups give her enough credit. I don't know what it is that here's a woman who handled a case in the 50s from all the way through, but she's in the U.S. Supreme Court arguing for the state. And she starts out her argument by making this note that one of the state's exhibits disappeared one of the obscene books ended up missing. And she says, when the exhibits are returned to the Court of Common Pleas, there was just the cover of this one obscene book that came back. We don't know what happened to it. And one of the justices, it's not clear who, because these are just, oral or audio recordings, says, has the clerk been indicted? Of course, everybody laughs. So, I mean, again, kind of an interesting note. So, and this is the quote from her. So the lead opinion in MAP is authored by Thomas Clark. Truman appointed Clark to the bench. He served from 49 to 67. He didn't have a lot of judicial experience, but Truman in his biography said it was the worst pick he ever made for a judge ever. Called him the worst pick, my worst pick ever. And why was that? Well, it was because Clark sat on and wrote Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And if you remember, that was the big Union steel case in the 50s during the Korean War. And, it really caused Truman a nightmarish experience. He did vote with the majority in Brown versus Board of Education. He was the father of U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, and he was replaced when he left the court by Thurgood Marshall. So real fast here, before I get to the second case, MAP, it really was a big story in the media. I mean, it was covered across the country, covered here extensively. She became like a cause celeb, Dolly Mapp was like a figure. She was interviewed by local and national media outlets. She really felt vindicated in all of her commentaries. And of course, the police and prosecutors were outraged. They thought this was going to be the end of the world. We have to get a warrant to go into somebody's house. The New York Times ran a whole series of stories on the case. This is just one little one I picked up. But the other aspects were the editorial commentaries that went on in newspapers across the country. And you can Google these and read them. They're rather interesting for the time period, but everybody weighed in on it. And most were supportive, but many were wary and cautious due to the response from law enforcement, the concerns that the law enforcement were raising about this issue. This was a new day in America. So what happened? So Chandra Burns, he was not a member of the mafia, but he worked closely with the mafia members in the 60s and 70s. Eventually he got into a dispute with Cleveland racketeer Danny Green over a $75,000 loan from the Gambino family in New York. Apparently the Gambinos had sent a courier with this money, and somewhere along the line, once it got to Cleveland, the money ends up missing. Green blames Burns for the missing money. Burns blames Green for the missing money. But guess what? The Gambinos don't care, right? They're blaming both of them for the missing money. So this was a source of contention between Burns and Green. Of course, neither of which were Italian, so they couldn't be in the mafia, but they were actively working in association with their mafia. Now, at that time, there was a split in the Cleveland mafia, and there were two camps that had emerged within the Italian community running the Cleveland mafia. And Burns and Green were on opposite sides of that split. So what happens? In March of 1975, Burns is blown up by a bomb in the lot behind Christie's Lounge at 2516 Detroit Avenue. That location today is the site of a kind of an upscale apartment building, I would say, where they're getting $1,500 a month for its efficiency. Some crazy money like that. But Burns had tried to kill Green earlier, and although the initial numbers operators were the suspects, Burns's death had all the trademarks of a Danny Green hit. Burns was killed with C4 explosives, although Green was never charged. And this was a front page story on the Cleveland Plain Dealer the next morning. In fact, you can look there that the North Vietnamese had just captured Da Nang the day before too. So end of the line for Chandra Burns. He's buried in Hillcrest Cemetery in Bedford Heights. Now, Burns's widow was oblivious to the conflict between Danny Green and Burns because he had largely sheltered his wife from a lot of his underworld activities. Aware that Green also was a pet lover, she ends up giving Burns his Doberman Pinscher as a gift. How twisted is that? But so this is an image of Burns's gravesite. Danny Green. He's raised in an orphanage. He's a former U.S. Marine, union organizer with the Longshoremen. He read the book On the Waterfront. He called his Irish gang the Celtic Club. He killed at least 8 of the mafia hitmen sent to assassinate him. And of course, he was the subject of the book and film, To Kill the Irishman. He used to go around and give out green pens. He drove a green Lincoln Continental. He wore green suits. I mean, you know, he was all about being green. But the end came for him in October of 1977. He went to a dental visit at Cedar and Chagrin, parked his car, went into the dentist's office. The mafia pulled a Nova next to his car, waited him for him to come out, and a remote bomb was exploded in the Nova, killing Green as he was getting into his green Lincoln Continental. But he would get revenge in death because federal prosecutors moved in then to really shut down the Cleveland Mafia by the 1990s. And by the 1990s, all were either dead or in jail. Don King, he would go on to become the greatest promoter in boxing history, handling Muhammad Ali, George Foreman. He did the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire. He did the Thrilla in Manila in the Philippines, the Ali Frazier fights. He was sued by every boxer he ever represented, including Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, and Mike Tyson. Now, you may wonder, how am I going to get a Michael Jackson reference into this presentation? Well, Don King managed the victory tour, the Jackson's victory tour in 1984. And in 1998, he purchased the Call Post. He's still alive. Don King is still alive. He's got to be in his 90s. Virgil Ogletree, the fellow who was arrested in the basement, he was never charged with the bombing of Don King's home. He was a lifetime friend of Dalry Mapp. He was involved in gambling activities until his death at age 82. He did have legitimate businesses, including a dry cleaning business on Cleveland's east side. He was never charged in the bombing. He was well liked and respected by those involved in both legitimate and criminal activities. He's very close to Chandra Burns. Now, Bernard Berkman went on to handle a number of ACLU cases. I love this headline: hippie leader Levy gets 6 months in jail. I mean, you know, can't make this stuff up. But he led the ACLU for a number of years. He was involved in a number of cases. He passed away in the early 2000s. Same with Seymour Terrell. Now, Dalry Mapp, she would go on and leave Cleveland for New York City. She started a furniture business in Manhattan, but invariably she got involved in a fencing operation and a drug operation in the Queens of New York. She went to prison for 9 years. She did 9 years in prison after the Mapp case. She was later pardoned by Governor Hugh Carey of New York. She lived in Queens until her death in Conyers, Georgia on October 31st, 2014. She went down there and she had a niece, her daughter Barbara's sister's niece, or daughter rather, took care of her to the end. So that is our Dalry Mapp v. Ohio story. You learned a little bit about the personalities. Now, in the time remaining, I'm going to switch over to Terry v. Ohio, and we'll have some more interesting characters. So we just got to take a second here. Oh, no. Those down there, we'll get rid of those, and now we'll try this one. Let me see here. So here we go, Terry v. Ohio. So this is the other big, it's amazing that these, you could make an argument that Terry v. Ohio and Mapp v. Ohio are the two biggest cases in Ohio, in American criminal jurisprudence history. And they both happened right here in the city of Cleveland, and many of the locations are still around. You can walk the streets right by them if you want to. So let's go through these and I'll try to touch on this. So this was the old, for those of you that are local, and I realize there's a lot of people not from Cleveland that are on the video stream. So I'm trying to explain this a little bit. Anybody from Cleveland knows this location very well. Euclid and Huron and 12th, where they all kind of come together, the triangle, if you will, where the big chandeliers are now. Right, exactly. But just to give a sense of people that this was the dominant shopping area in Cleveland from roughly, I would say, the 1920s through the 1970s. If you wanted anything, this is generally where you had to go. This is before the suburban shopping malls, before Amazon.com, before all that stuff. There was this stretch of territory between Public Square and roughly East 18th where you would shop. and for anything and everything. Sterling Linder, Halley's, Higbee's, May Company, all those stores were down there at that time. And of course, the triangle building that you see here is where the current Playhouse Square Hotel is located, the old Wyndham Hotel, as some of us know it as. But it retains the same shape, distinctive triangle shape today that the former building had. Now, let's go into some of our personalities. This is John Terry. He was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1932. He was one of 7 children. His mother sadly died in childbirth. He was arrested in Memphis as a juvenile. He spent 1 year in an agricultural training school. He moved to Cleveland, where his stepmother's sister resided. Eventually, a number of the Terrys from Memphis, Tennessee, settled in Cleveland, and particularly in East Cleveland. John Terry had an older sister, May Stewart. Some of you in this room may remember May Stewart. She was involved in government in East Cleveland for many, many years. And she would play a prominent role in his life, as well as in the East Cleveland government. She also had a relative, Bishop Terry. Many of you would remember Bishop Terry. He was a prominent member of the clergy from East Cleveland. Now, Terry served in the U.S. Armed Forces, where it is believed he developed a drug problem. After he moved to Cleveland, he was arrested, convicted of burglary and various violations of state drug laws. He did serve time in the Ohio State Reformatory, and his last parole date was June 17th of 1959. He lived at 1275 East 105th Street in Cleveland at this time period. Now, Richard Chilton was born March 28th, 1937 in Belle Vernon, Pennsylvania, came to Cleveland in 1946. In 1953, at age 16, he became a printer. He was in the Printers Union in Cleveland. He worked at Grand Printing in Cleveland. He married in 1956, but separated from his wife. She moved to California. They had no children. He briefly relocated to Chicago, where he also worked as a printer at the R.M. Demian Company, and he ended up back in Cleveland in 1962. At that time, he was unemployed. He lived with his mother, Mossy Chilton, at 16101 Lotus Drive in Cleveland. That was at the time of his arrest. Now, our third figure in this is Carl Katz. Carl Katz was 49 years old at the time of his arrest. He lived at 3755 Mayfield Road in the Heights Garden Apartments in Cleveland Heights. Now, Chilton knew Katz from his job as a bar manager on the East Side. There's no record of what exactly Terry's relationship with Katz was, but they clearly knew each other. In 1967, during one of the books summarizing the case, there's no record that anybody knows that Katz had a prior criminal record, but there's really not a whole lot known about his background beyond that. Now, one of our other figures in this drama is Martin J. McFadden. He's probably the classic Irish police officer of the mid-20th century. He's born in 1901. He briefly works as a timekeeper for the Cleveland Railway Company, and then he joins the Cleveland Police Force in 1925. By 1930, he was promoted to detective. And 1934, he went into the fraud unit, where he worked the downtown area watching for shoplifters and pickpockets. McFadden had a warm and engaging personality, knew all the merchants and regular shoppers in the area. Now, one of his arch nemesis was a thief named Louis the Dip Finkelstein. It's a true name. Finkelstein was arrested 121 times by the Cleveland police between 1909 and 1959. In 1933, he spent time in 3 different jails in a 48-hour period for theft. So this was McFadden's job. Walk this beat between Public Square up to East 18th, around Huron, around Euclid Avenue, look for pickpockets, look for shoplifters, look for any kind of activity and so naturally, doing this day in and day out, he got to know pretty much all the merchants. He knew the regular shoppers. He knew everybody. So he was a little bit of a known entity in this area. Now, the events of October 31st, 1963, Halloween, Dolly Mapp's birthday. At 2:15, McFadden is walking east on Huron Road, and he observes 2 African-American men, Chilton and Terry, peering into windows on Huron Road near the back of the United Airlines office at 1276 Euclid Avenue. For anybody who's young, when you used to have to get an airline ticket, you would go to the airline ticket office. They had these airline ticket offices downtown. It was like United, the Trans World Airways, all these, and you would go there and you'd buy your ticket and you get a ticket. So these 2 individuals were later joined by a white male, that was Katz, and they appeared to be casing locations for a possible robbery. So McFadden watches them from a store opening. The store was called Rogoff's, which was on 1260 Huron Road. And McFadden follows them from Huron Road onto Euclid Avenue, where they walk to the front of Zucker's Men's Store at 1130 Euclid Avenue. McFadden then stops all three, pats Terry down, recovers a handgun, orders all three into Zucker's Men's Store, where he pats the others down and recovers a handgun from Chilton. Katz did not have a weapon. McFadden did not play favorites. He arrested all three. What did he arrest Katz for? Being a suspicious person. Could be arrested for being a suspicious person back in that time. So here's our little area for anybody that is unfamiliar with this. The red line, as you look at this, the shorter red line is Huron, and that would be the area of the back of the United Airlines store. And then the individuals would walk around the triangle, the point of the triangle, and head west on Euclid, on the south side of Euclid, all the way down to 1130, where the X is near the top right of the photograph. So that gives you a sense of how this plays out. Now we'll go into a little more detail on this. This is the back of the Halley building today. The arrow coming down in red is roughly where Chilton, Katz, and Terry are first observed. And the green arrow points across Huron to where McFadden was located. Here's the former site of Rogoff's at 1260 Huron Road. And in that little alcove entry is where McFadden stands looking across the street to observe Chilton, Terry, and Katz. Here's 1276 Euclid Avenue, or where it would have been back in those days. This is part of the hotel complex now, but this is the site of the front of the United Airlines office that is the subject of part of this. Here's 1120 Euclid Avenue. I'm not sure if it's 1120 or 1130, but Zucker's Men's Store was located here. Here's actually where the stop and frisk takes place, involving initially Terry and then Chilton and Katz inside the store. And this is the same building. It's still there today. You can walk by it and see it for yourself, where this all took place. Here is the Cleveland Police Headquarters at 21st and Payne back in the day. This is where what would happen is McFadden would call for a paddy wagon. Go figure, right? Politically incorrect term. Being Irish, a paddy wagon was summoned. Paddy means Irish, right? Pick up the Irish drunks, and you know. So they call for a paddy wagon. Katz and Chilton and Terry are taken to Cleveland Police Headquarters at 21st and Payne, and then McFadden will go over there and then write his report. And here's the front of the building for, especially, I'm mainly doing this for the people that are on Zoom watching this, because they probably, many of you in this room know these locations, but people outside don't. So this is very much what I call the Barney Miller Police Headquarters, right? Those of you that remember the show from the 70s, Barney Miller, that's what this is. It's really a classic building. So here is McFadden's incident report. And yes, the young lady in the back, it is a one-page report. And actually in the materials, I have included a readable copy of this if you want it. If you look in the materials, I have included a readable copy. I also want to stop for a minute and mention this about the materials. I have a note that John Terry writes to the judge later, and it gives you a better appreciation of John Terry. He was not just some drugged out, strung out criminal. He writes a really eloquent note to the judge that I have included in the materials as well, that you can take a look at. Here's John T. Corrigan again. I don't necessarily have to go into all of his background, but he's the lead person on all these cases, at least in terms of he's the elected prosecutor at the time. Now, he assigns this case to Reuben Payne. And many of you may wonder, well, who is Reuben Payne? Well, Reuben Payne was born in Scioto, Ohio, in Harrison County in 1922. It's a small town of only 850 residents at the time of his birth. He served in the U.S. Army in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, between 1942 and 1945. He then came to Cleveland, graduated from Western Reserve University in 49 and Cleveland Marshall in 53. In addition to his private law practice, he worked at the U.S. General Accounting Office. He left the prosecutor's office after being hired by John T. in 1957. Briefly went on the State Personal Board of Review. In 1964, he returned to the county prosecutor's office, and John T. Corrigan assigned him the case of Terry v. Ohio, or what would be known as the case of Terry v. Ohio. So he's one of the first African-American prosecutors. And this case would represent the first time that we would have an African-American prosecutor, an African-American defense lawyer, and since Thurgood Marshall would sit on the case, an African-American Supreme Court justice in American history. All happened right here in downtown Cleveland. Lou Stokes. Everybody in Cleveland remembers Lou Stokes. For those of you that are not from Cleveland and are not aware of his career, he was one of the best young trial lawyers in Cleveland in 1963 at the time of this incident. He was born in Cleveland in 1925. He had a brother, Carl, who went on to become the first African-American mayor of a major American city. That was here in Cleveland. Both of these young men were raised in the first federally funded housing project, the Outhwaite Homes at 55th and Woodland in Cleveland. They were raised by their widowed mother, Louise. Their father died in 1928 when these kids were very young. So they would both work under legendary Cleveland trial lawyer Norman S. Minor. And in 1930, Norman S. Minor became Cuyahoga County's first Black assistant prosecutor. Remember Frank T. Culleton from the other case. He was widely regarded as one of Ohio's greatest trial lawyers. Stokes would learn under Minor, then emerge as a great trial lawyer in his own right. Minor, Stokes, and his brother Carl had their law offices at 2584 East 55th Street in Cleveland. Now, how did Lou Stokes get on John Terry's case? Well, May Stewart, who was active in government in East Cleveland, had reached out to Lou and asked him, you need to help John and support him. And he did. Stokes took on the case as their lawyer. Now, just briefly, for people that aren't familiar with Cleveland, that's Carl on the left, the younger, and Lou on the right. And here's an image of Outhwaite Homes at the time it was constructed, and they had moved into these residences in 1938. And here's a picture of them with their mother. You got to love a picture with two men with their mother, right? Come on. So that's their family. Now, where do these cases play out at? Well, of course, the old criminal courts building at 21st Street and Payne. This is where the trial took place at. This is where all the hearings took place at, the sentencing, everything. Now, interesting about this place, when you talk to old timers that remember the old criminal courts building at 21st, the tower portion of this was the jail. So the inmates would stuff toilet paper in all the toilets and flush them to no end. And guess what would happen to the courtroom sections down in the lower levels? Yeah, a lot of lousy water would find its way down into those areas. So again, this facility was in operation until the Justice Center opened in 1976. Here's the site today. It's a parking lot. I'm big on forensic photography. I don't know why. I just like looking at old stuff and then what was there now, you know? So here's McFadden. Here's our detective. One of the things that I find fascinating about him is he was 64 years old at the time of the Terry stop. Can you imagine being 64 years old, working a beat, and then arresting three guys that are half your age? Unbelievable. Stokes and others referred to him as Mac. When I talked to Lou Stokes about the case before Lou passed, he told me he was a straight shooter by all standards. He didn't pull punches. He was a decent guy, just doing his job in his mind. So Judge Bernard Friedman, who everyone in this room knows his son, Judge Friedman, Stuart Friedman, who served on the Common Pleas Court for many years. But Judge Bernard Friedman was the judge that was assigned the case. And I think he never has gotten his due in relationship to this case. He was born in Poland in 1909. He came to the United States. He graduated from John Hay. He went to Ohio State, got his law degree here at Case Western Reserve University in 1934. He held a variety of positions. He was in the Cleveland Law Department. He was a lawyer for the Cleveland Transit Union, but he got appointed judge by Governor Michael DeSalle in the early 60s, and he was assigned this case. He was very respected by the attorneys, and Stokes spoke very highly of him, saying that I knew I was going to at least get a fair shake with Friedman as the trial judge. Now, this was Friedman's opinion, which was published. he was astute enough to know that this case was a big case, even though no one at the time fully appreciated how big of a case this was going to be. And he wrote that frisking by a police officer of a person stopped for interrogation because of suspicious conduct is proper to meet the practical demands of effective criminal investigation and the safety of the officer. The omission of evidence of the fruit of the frisk in a prosecution for carrying concealed weapons does not. This would go on to essentially become the law of stop and frisk, but Friedman never gets credit for it, in my opinion. He does a thorough examination of the facts and the law, and I believe all the subsequent reviewing courts basically stole his idea. I really, really feel that. I thought he was way ahead of the game in figuring this out. Now, the case came to the 8th District Court of Appeals in February 10th of 1966. At that time, there were 3 judges that handled this, Judge Silbert, Judge Artle, and Judge J.J.P. Corrigan. What was interesting was they saw that there might be future litigation associated with this case. And they saw it so much that they wanted to comment on it, that they said, if such abuse arises, we shall deal with them when the time comes. Well, what have we been doing for the last 65 years in the United States? We're dealing with stop and frisk cases, right? I mean, probable cause, reasonable articulable suspicion. So even they were somewhat ahead of their time. I will make one comment about J.J.P. Corrigan, not because he's Irish, but because of this. He was a city prosecutor from 1933 to 1937. In 1942, he joined the U.S. Army at age 41 as a private. So he went off the 8th District Court of Appeals, became a private in the Army, and at age 43, he landed on Normandy on D-Day. At age 43, amazing. So, and he's buried in Lakewood Park Cemetery. I could go on and on about all these characters, but we don't have a lot of time. So the case goes on to the Ohio Supreme Court, and they sua sponte dismiss the appeal, noting no substantial constitutional. Do you think they might have wanted to have a redo of that? But they didn't. That was it. So now many of you, we all call this case Terry v. Ohio, but guess what? It was not Terry v. Ohio. It was Chilton v. Ohio for the whole thing leading up to when it got to the United States Supreme Court. Terry was not even on the thing. Chilton was shot and killed in an armed robbery in Columbus in 1967. And that's when the case became Terry v. Ohio. Most people don't know this, but this is the news article counting that. And it goes to show you how big this case was becoming in American jurisprudence, that one of the defendants is shot and killed in a robbery in Columbus, that it ends up in a news article. So kind of a sad end for Chilton, but and how about this robbery? When you read the article, they got away with $23,000 in cash from a store. Why was that? And I had to think about it, and then people reminded me, well, in those days, certain stores, certain bars, certain restaurants on Fridays had huge sums of money because why? People went there to cash their paychecks, right? So that's why there was that much money there. And in an inglorious manner, Chilton was left dead by his 2 fellow robbers. So there was no honor among them. So I'm going to get real fast here and finish this up. It goes on to the U.S. Supreme Court. We know the outcome. They affirm the stop and frisk doctrine. Earl Warren writes the lead opinion of the court. Thurgood Marshall participates in it. He was a big fan of Earl Warren. He sides with the police. Most people identify Marshall as a defense-oriented jurist, and he was, certainly, but in this case, he sides with the police. William Douglas writes a dissent. The postscript of this, McFadden goes on to become somewhat of a celebrity. Some of you young people will have to Google Mae West, but she was quite the something back in the day, and that's McFadden off to the side there, and he used to be a bodyguard for her. He retires in 1970, a news story about him. Here's where he's buried. He died in 1981, and that's his wife there. In 2003, we worked to get a historical marker put up, and it's right there at the triangle. It tells the story of McFadden and the case. And then here we have Congressman Stokes. And of course, he's buried in Lakeview Cemetery. And on his tombstone, I think I have it here, is aim high from the projects to Congress. So quite a legacy. This was over at Marshall Law School when the Stokes family, we got a monument erected, Terry v. Ohio. Unfortunately, it's not at 1120 Euclid, but it's in what I call Monument Valley in the Huntington Park area there. And this is what was the dedication day that when we did the thing. So Reuben Payne, he would go on to Arizona. He always defended McFadden's right to stop and frisk. He went on to lecture about the case many times at St. John's University in New York, which has a great archive of the case. And he died in 2013 at age 90. May Stewart went on to try to get help for John Terry. She had him placed in Lima Hospital at one point. This is before drug courts. If there had been a drug court, maybe John Terry would have made it. But she was a very dynamic person in her own right. John Terry would pass away. He was beaten up in jail during one of his episodes. And it's a sad story. He went into a coma. He never came out of it, and he died in a hospital. He went on to have a number of other arrests. They were almost always drug related. It's kind of a sad ending. Now, one interesting story, and I know I'm getting into your time here, but I think this is a great story of life. So May Stewart, she had, well, when Terry was in prison, one of his relatives, Robert Stewart, was only 14, would go to visit him. And he thought Terry was a nice guy, but he didn't want that kind of life. Stewart went on to become a member of the Columbus Police Department. And while he was there at the police department, a recruit came through named Chris Chilton. Little did you know that Chris Chilton was related to Richard Chilton. So both Chilton and Terry had two relatives after the fact that serve on the Columbus Police Department. And here's an image of them. And the young man who I think is the second from the left with the glasses on, that's Marty McFadden's nephew. So we got all of them together, and it's a kind of a nice little postscript. So I don't think I have anything else. Let me see. Do I have something else? These are just the source materials. Go down to the Cleveland Museum, Police Museum, and the Justice Center if you want to look at any of this stuff. It's all there. They'll get it out for you. You can look at it all. So without further ado, thank you very much.
Judge Gallagher truly is a great storyteller. So we're going to have a 15-minute break and we will return at 1:15. Thank you.